and welcome to Pressure Point. I'm your host for this program. My name is Valerie Dudoward. My guest is Vina Starr, and I welcome you to the program, Vina.
Thank you, Valerie.
You are from the Haisla Nation.
Yes, I am.
In northwestern British Columbia, and you've also had your own law practice for the last 7 years. And as the topic of our program this time round is the future of Aboriginal self-government, and your law practice deals very much with Indian self-government. I think a really good point to start off with would be to find out how you got started on your journey as a lawyer.
It started when I was about 34 with the occasion of my brother being arrested for fishing without an Indian food fish license. And that would have been about 1978. And that was the period during which our salmon runs were at their lowest. And the circumstances surrounding his arrest are important, if only to show the innocence of the background. And what happened is the way an Indian food fish license works is that an Indian person goes to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans office during normal office hours during the week to obtain his or her food fish license. And generally speaking, it's issued for a 48-hour period from 6 o'clock on Friday night until 6 o'clock on Sunday night. And it is issued to a specific person to fish at a specific place. And so my brother did that, except that there was no fish. And rather than stay until Sunday, he went home and heard that the sockeye were running in the Skeena, and he was invited by a member of one of the Skeena bands to come and fish from their reserve, and he did on the Sunday afternoon. And he put his net into the water without a food fish license, and he was promptly arrested by a fisheries officer who was hiding behind the bushes.
Ah, the old bushes.
Oh, well, of course,
routine.
That's the way it's done. And he was charged with 5 different counts, including fishing without a food fish license and ending with assault of a police or a fisheries officer. And the assault charge arose because he refused to accept the ticket. And the fisheries officer stood in front of the truck, and my brother kept driving. And the fisheries officer jumped out of the way, but the assault charge was based on those facts. My mother phoned in quite a panic. I was living in Fort St. John at the time, and her concern was the fact that there would be a criminal record. And this was of concern to us because there had never been any criminal activity of any kind associated with either the immediate Starr family or the extended Starr family up to that point. In fact, Uncle Tim had been the chief for many years. And so when those events all transpired, I realized that Indian people were being criminalized for the lack of fish that had been directly caused by pollution and the lack of will of political governments to prosecute polluters.
And in 1978, this was when the incident with your brother occurred. And was this when you first had serious thoughts of becoming a lawyer or going to law school?
Oh, no. I had, from the age of 12, and that was the year that I attended an integrated junior high school, I was able to observe the discrepancy in the standard of living between an Indian community and a white community, such as Kitimat is. They are two separate communities, separated by 8 miles, one consisting of 10,000 people and the other consisting of just under 1,000. And at the young age of 12, I could not understand what reason, good reason, there could be to explain the discrepancy.
And what does some of that discrepancy consist of for people who may not be familiar with communities like that?
When I was growing up in the 50s and early 60s, the discrepancy was the difference between dirt roads in Kitimat village as opposed to paved roads. And there didn't seem to be any difference in the people because everybody worked for Alcan. And another difference was the fact that our electricity was turned off at 10 o'clock at night rather than 24 hours, which is what the townspeople had. And the fact that there was no road connecting the two communities at that time. And school for me meant school boat, being down at the dock at 7:30 in the morning to catch a half-hour school boat ride over to the town site to catch a bus at 8 o'clock, and it took almost an hour to go by bus to school. And all of this, of course, meant that coming home with the school bus waiting for us, we couldn't participate in extracurricular activities. So those were the differences.
It seems that you were very cognizant of those kinds of realities for somebody who was 12 years old.
Well, it was quite plain for everybody to see. They were graphic.
I also grew up in the north. I'm from a different tribal nation, from the Tsimshian Nation, and I grew up in Prince Rupert, and so I didn't grow up on reserve. And I had many, many cousins who grew up on reserve, living in Metlakatla, a village just across the harbor. But still, at least a half-hour to 45-minute boat ride. Mm-hmm. And I saw a lot of differences as a child in the way that I lived and the way that they lived. And in some ways, some of the ways that they lived, I really envied because of their close contact with the land and with the ocean. But a lot of the things that you're talking about seem so familiar to me when I would travel to Metlakatla and Port Simpson.
Yeah. So going back to that time, I had always known that I would get my education so that I could come back and work for my people. And I did. I went home and worked for my band in 1969 for 3 going on 4 years, and helped set up their first preschool and library, and got people qualified to come home and run them. And then left and went to Fort St. John and taught at Northern Lights College there for some time. But it was my realization that the bands were going to need help to understand their rights and their responsibilities. And that was in the back of my mind when my brother was arrested. And perhaps it was his arrest that prompted me to pursue my new career at quite a late age. I was 41 when I was called to the bar.
And you had mentioned before that was in 1986?
That's right.
And
yes.
You graduated from the...
In 1984 from UBC. Mm-hmm.
And then very soon after that time, you set up your own practice.
Well, no, actually, I was hired, I was appointed as a research associate to the Faculty of Law at UBC after my call to the bar. And so for the term of that appointment, I set up self-government seminars for Indian chiefs and their councils and band staff in general. And it wasn't until 1987 that I opened my law practice and continued that work.
And I understand that it's very successful and that you're kept very busy.
Yes, I travel throughout this province of BC, teaching band councils the scope of their powers and their responsibilities under our Constitution and either their own treaty or the Indian Act. And I also teach the directors of their companies their liabilities and their powers as well.
The title of our program this time around is The Future of Aboriginal Self-Government. And I think maybe for some of our viewers, before they can begin to understand some of the issues that First Nations are looking toward in the future, it might help for them to have some background as to what, from your perspective, Indian or Aboriginal self-government is, what that would involve.
The quest toward Indian self-government, and I will limit our discussion to Indian self-government just for this portion, was made popular about 10 years ago by Indian politicians, in particular Aboriginal politicians in general. And their quest was for more local control, as opposed to the centralized control that the Minister of Indian Affairs has under the Indian Act, whereby every bylaw, starting from an animal control or a dog control bylaw, passed by a band council has to be personally approved by the Minister of Indian Affairs. That is the antithesis or the opposite of what Indian and Aboriginal people refer to when they say that they want Indian or Aboriginal self-government. On the other hand, what I think non-Indian people hear when they hear that statement or that request or that aspiration is they hear, oh, the Indians want total sovereignty within their own lands, such as to effect a totally separate country from Canada. And I think that that is the wrong message. In my experience, taking instructions from councils and general band members on the drafting of their band constitutions, their membership laws, their election regulations, they all assume that they are Canadians and that Canada is their country, but that they ought to have the right to make their laws for their own communities.
And within those communities, based on your experience in your travels and your discussions with Aboriginal leaders or Native leaders, how involved do you think community people are in the various processes that are going on leading to self-government?
Well, unfortunately, I believe that in the majority of Indian communities or Aboriginal communities in general, it may have been that the political leaders have left the people in the community behind in terms of the involvement of the community members in the actual governing or the institutions of the community. And in those cases, the band members or the community members are very fearful of what self-government might look like at the hands of those political leaders who have distanced themselves from the reality of political development within their own community. The few communities where the leaders have genuinely attempted to involve the community members important decision making for their self-determination. There is enthusiasm and good talent and good education, but they are the minority. And the other thing that I've come to realize just in the last year or so in my travels is that there has been a great deal of both physical and spiritual and emotional damage done to both Indian men and women, apparently at the hands or as a result of their experience in residential school. That experience is not uniform throughout the country by any means, because there are differences between the denominations apparently as to how they respectively ran their schools. But I know that in some residential schools, counselors, existing counselors today of bands who suffered the sexual and the physical assaults have helped me to understand that white society as a whole succeeded in those residential school institutions in convincing people like this counselor to whom I refer that they were indeed worthless, and therefore they act, or at least have acted, that way.
I think that's very powerful reality. I was just observing that for a moment, and it reminded me of another reality that existed up until about the last 30 years. And I think many people do not really know the history and the dates appropriate to that history that occurred between First Nations people and the rest of society in Canada. And one of those realities has to do with voting rights. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, it was John Diefenbaker who gave Indians the right to vote federally. And so that in my father's case, for example, who was born in 1900, he was 60 years old when he first voted. And so if the larger non-Aboriginal society within Canada is concerned about the capability of Aboriginal people to govern themselves, they ought not to be terribly surprised that the rudiments of an electoral system, for example, which have been denied to a whole segment of society based on race only, is going to take at least another decade before those institutions become ordinarily known and useful.
And where we're at now is at a point where some agreements have been signed
Yes.
in this country between nations and the nation of Canada. How close to your sense of Aboriginal self-government do those agreements come?
Well, those agreements number 6 at the moment, and they could be called modern treaties. And they started in 1975 with the James Bay Creena-Scappi agreement. And you will recall that that modern day treaty was negotiated under duress.
Yes.
Rather than from a mutually level playing field. So it set the pattern, and for good or for bad, it set up a system whereby the Crees, which number 8 communities, own large tracts of land, which is divided into 3 categories. The first category they own outright and have exclusive lawmaking control over it. The second category, they have the right of veto over resource development on such things as geese and moose, where their survival takes a priority to mining rights of Quebec, for example. And the third category is they have the right to be consulted on any development of the natural resources within that area. And by and large, that pattern has been followed in varying degrees, perhaps with the exception of the Sechelt Self-Government Act, whereby the Sechelt merely accepted fee simple title to their existing reserve lands and moved themselves out from under the Indian Act.
And what is fee simple title?
Fee simple title means that a person or a nation owns the land, as Jimmy Gosnell said before he died, lock, stock, and barrel. It is 100% ownership of everything on, within, and under that land to a certain degree.
So within those agreements, and I understand that the Sechelt Agreement differs in that sense from the others.
It does.
Do you see the movement of Aboriginal self-government as staying within those parameters?
No, not at all. The majority of the 6 modern self-government or treaties, land settlement agreements, transfers entire lawmaking authority from the federal crown to the Aboriginal nation. And in that sense, the nation is sovereign within its own boundaries. But to a larger extent, federal laws do apply within the territory of that nation, and that's no different from any of the existing agreements where the authority of Canada as a nation is taken to be supreme over the lawmaking authority of any of those First Nations. Now, we know that the Mohawks do not and never have subscribed to that theory of Aboriginal self-government. The Mohawks have always asserted that they asserted the two-row wampum theory, where and it's a constitutional theory, where they believe that the laws of Canada should not apply to them, and vice versa, that their laws should not apply to Canada, but that each nation should respect the laws of the other. Now, they've not been able to convince any Canadian government to accept that, and that is...
I think that would take very powerful negotiation skills to do that kind of convincing.
I think that the majority, and this is my own opinion, I believe that the majority of Aboriginal people in Canada are Canadians first, and have been asking the larger Canadian public to respect the right of the Aboriginal communities to govern themselves within their own communities in exactly the same way that municipalities have the right to make their own laws governing their own people, except that in the case of the Aboriginal jurisdiction, it would be a hybrid between the federal lawmaking power and the provincial lawmaking power, rather than between the provincial lawmaking power and the municipal lawmaking power. And it's that overlap of Aboriginal government onto the two spheres of the federal jurisdiction and the provincial jurisdiction that we really ought to be focusing on to make sure that the Aboriginal governments have jurisdiction over family and wills and estates and education and property and civil rights within the boundaries of the reserve, and that the business of defense be left with the federal government where it properly belongs.
I think this discussion for myself as well has really clarified many things, because as a First Nations person who doesn't live on reserve, and probably more than 50% of us do not live on reserve, that sometimes I feel very much left out of the discussion. And my sense is that a lot of Canadian citizens would want to support some part of what you have discussed without putting themselves in fear, as I think sometimes was wrongly stated in the past, of losing their own personal homes or the land that their home sits on. And I think that kind of uncertainty and lack of correct and accurate information really generates a lot of unnecessary fear with people.
Well, it does, and given that there has been a legislated chasm in our society between Aboriginal people and the non-Aboriginal settlers, this deliberate miscommunication or neglectful communication is not serving either segment of our society at all.
If people would want to get involved in terms of at least being informed, what resources can you suggest off the top of your head that they might tap into?
That has been asked of me on a number of times, particularly during the Oka crisis. Ordinary Canadians phoned to ask, and I suggested that they volunteer their services to Indian organizations such as the Gidiksan-Wet'suwet'en people who have an office down here and who do need volunteers for mail-outs of informational brochures and things like that from time to time. And I would also suggest that they might get involved with Native theater groups. And, but just as importantly, volunteer their services to their local church, because there are Indian people in their immediate community who are alone and isolated and would appreciate a potluck supper on a Sunday night in their local church, I'm sure.
Vina Starr, I want to thank you very much for appearing as my guest this program.
It's been my pleasure.
My name is Valerie Dudoward, and this has been Pressure Point.
The preceding program was produced through the facilities of Rogers Community 4, Vancouver. We want to hear from you and invite you to leave your comments and suggestions on our 24-hour response line message machine. Please call 731-5812.